I'm going to apologise at the outset because I'm going to repeat a little bit of what Jamie's told you, but I wanted to start with Colonel Charles Myers. And as you can see from here, he was the leading shell shock exponent in the British Army in the First World War. He has a prehistory, as we've seen, as an experimental psychologist. He's been to the Torres Straits, and he's crucially responsible for the introduction of forward psychiatry for the BEF in December 1916. So it's the key intervention for restoring shell-shocked soldiers back to duty on the battlefield. But, as we'll see, towards the end of the war, he becomes increasingly disillusioned. In October 1917, he asked to be transferred back to the UK because he's getting fed up with what's going on in France. And in 1919, he writes that his demobilisation came as a relief because he's just got so worn down by the pressures on him to deliver an effective service. And in 1921, when the Southborough Committee is looking for someone to give evidence, and he's a key witness, he says, no, I can't face it, it's too distressing. And it's not until 1940, when we get another war, that he sits down and writes up what he'd done, his diary of shell shock in France. So what could have happened to Myers, this man with this creditable research record, a fellow of the Royal Society? Why was he so worn down, and what does this tell us about the burgeoning speciality of psychology? Well, the conventional narrative of the war, it's a vast human experiment involving 5.7 million soldiers, at least 250,000 cases of shell shock. The work that was done to understand their condition and get them better transforms the understanding of psychological disorders. And the theory is that the doctors, the shell-shock doctors from all directions who've engaged in this work after the war suddenly advance civilian practice as they translate the knowledge. So that's the conventional narrative. And I want to explore really how true that is. Well, first of all, there's a lot of psychology around in the pre-1914 period. We know that essentially psychiatry in the 19th century is dominated by the asylum system. So if you have severe mental illness, you're certified and you go off to a county asylum. But what we can identify is the beginnings of experimental psychology and research into mental illness in universities and medical schools before the war has begun by people who are calling themselves psychologists. Now, I come from King's, so I did some research into the archives, and King's sets up its Department of Psychology in 1920. It's got a course of lectures and demonstrations, and it fits within, it's not an independent department, it fits within physiology and histology, and it's here in the King's main campus. And the guy who's running it is William G. Smith, Edinburgh graduate of philosophy, who's done psychological research in Germany. But he's part-time at King's doing his teaching, and then the rest of the time, interestingly, he's working down at Claybury Asylum for Frederick Mott, so he's got an input into major mental illness. Smith moves to Liverpool in 1904, and then Myers, who we've met, comes in and he's appointed part-time lecturer in experimental psychology at King's, and the course expands and it's now running over 2 terms. As we said, he's interesting, he's qualified in medicine, but he's not really a practitioner. He doesn't become a psychiatrist, he doesn't work in an asylum, he's more interested in research and anthropology. He goes to the Torres Straits, and there he is in the middle of the group with a beard next to William McDougall on this side and Rivers below them, and Seligman on the other side. He's interesting that in 1906 he gets the first chair in psychology, and it's at King's, but it's only on a part-time basis. At the same time as he's working at King's, he's also appointed a part-time demonstrator in Cambridge, and he tries to balance the 2 jobs, but it's a tough deal to be in 2 places over a week, and in 1909, he's worn out with his dual responsibilities, and he goes to Cambridge full-time, and he raises money for the laboratory in experimental psychology, and he becomes the director. William Brown is brought in at King's to replace Myers. He's a graduate in mathematics and natural science from Oxford, and he's doing research in mental philosophy. So he's not a clinician, he's not a doctor, but his work is on measuring the essentials of mental performance, and he's supervised by Pearson at Gresham. But he gets his doctorate, but before the war decides that he's also got to qualify in medicine at the same time. So he's just become a doctor on the outbreak of war. So what were the courses run at King's? By 1914, there are two of them running in parallel, one in the Faculty of Arts in conjunction with philosophy, and the other, obviously, in physiology. And by then, there are three members in the department. So it's small, it's growing, but it's established, and it's becoming multidisciplinary. And as we've heard, British Psychological Society's found it. Again, Myers is involved. And by 1912, the membership has reached 71, and it's composed of essentially of academics in different departments of universities. So here's the situation. As the war begins, as you can see, we've got a spread of researchers in different universities, essentially involved in experimental psychology. The one thing they're not doing at this stage is they're not doing clinical work and they're not studying psychopathology. So in a sense, they're not competing with the psychiatrists and the doctors. They are, in a sense, measuring things. They're interested in bodily function, reaction times, fatigue, attention, consciousness. So they're doing experimental research, which is almost an adjunct to physiology. And if you have something like shell shock, a functional psychosomatic illness, before the First World War, and you pitch up, once the doctors decide there's nothing physically wrong with you, they lose interest. So if I go along with some strange bodily sensations, which are interrupting my behavior, preventing me from working, if they can't find a defined illness, then the medical schools say, sorry, you're not for us. So what does the First World War do? It exposes a cross-section of the population, young and middle-aged men, to extreme danger. You know, Freud characterizes as an experiment in stress. Frighten the life out of people, threaten them with death, and see what happens. And what this does, it obviously creates huge numbers of psychiatric casualties, and it forces doctors to think of mental illness and breakdown in new ways. You can't simply see it as germ theory, degeneration, or the effects of hereditary families. So breakdown in battle essentially is not doing your job, and it's crucially related. They didn't know this at the time, but it's crucially related to the killed and wounded rate. So here we see units in the Second World War. These are secret files. They weren't published. These were results recorded by the doctors on the battlefield. You can see the top line is killed and wounded. The bottom line is psychiatric casualties. And just to demonstrate that it happens in different cultures, in different wars, at different times, same feature here, Yom Kippur, Israeli forces, 1973, the top line is killed and wounded, psychiatric casualties following behind. So as soon as you fight a war, as soon as you start killing and wounded, psychiatric breakdown is inevitable. And we can see that in the First World War, the casualty rates are colossal. At the Battle of the Somme, from July to November, we've got over 400,000 killed and wounded. So if we assume that only 15% of those would be shell shock, we would have at least 63,000 shell shock cases. And I suspect the reality is much higher. The disorder just emerges in the winter of 1914-15, and today we would characterize it as medically unexplained symptoms. It's not psychosis. It wouldn't manifest as depression. Essentially, soldiers are invalided from the battlefield with a whole range of physical and mental symptoms, which puzzle the doctors. And a lot of them are somatic, such as chest pain, difficulty breathing, palpitations. But of course, there is an overlap with PTSD. It's not the same as PTSD. There are some symptoms in common because it's a catch-all term. It's never properly defined. And it arises amongst soldiers saying, well, this is how I feel when I'm subjected to artillery bombardment. And the thing about shell shock is it's not just a medical disorder, it's a military crisis because there are so many men suffering. We estimate at least 240,000. The British could lose the war because it's a war of attrition and you need as many men in the front line as possible. And if you've got thousands and thousands of men leaving the front line, you're not going to be able to maintain your fighting strength. So the British Army gets interested, not fundamentally because it cares about individual soldiers, because it knows it's got to address this as a military medical emergency. Never before have so many doctors from so many disciplines been drawn together to study a single psychiatric disorder. In the pre-war period, you have asylum doctors in a self-contained, self-training system. And it's very low in the medical hierarchy. There's two strategies. And the treatment and the ideas that go with them are different. It depends where you break down and where you're treated. So in France, the agenda is to get people better as quickly as possible and back to duty. The motto of the US Army Medical Corps is to conserve the fighting strength. So the whole emphasis is quick treatment back to duty. But if you're invalided to the UK, then it's different. There's a different priority, different sorts of doctors. And these will be chronic or severe cases where the emphasis is getting the man back to health and back to productive employment, ideally in the army, but if not, working on in a factory or on a farm. As Jamie's mentioned, Myers' crucial intervention is to set up the specialist shell-shock units in December 1916, and they're located within 10 to 20 miles of the front line. And we analysed one of these. We went through all 3,500 cases to see who they were, how long they were treated, and what happened to them. And as you can see there, there's quite a range of ages, the oldest man being 59, the youngest 17, or some probably even younger. And the average period of treatment is 25 days. Officers are not included because it's a time of class, so officers are treated in a separate hospital. So these are all other ranks and NCOs. And we know from the distribution of soldiers on the ground that sergeants, corporals, warrant officers are overrepresented. You wouldn't expect to see that many, and we think that's because they're worn down. To get promotion to warrant officer sergeant, you've probably had to be there for quite a long time, and you've got war weary, you're just worn out. So you're seeing many more than you would expect to see. And this was the thing that really surprised us. We knew for every admission how long the man had been in France, and we plotted this. We weren't expecting to see any pattern at all, apart from the fact that most people tend to break down within about 10 months of being in France. But what we discovered was there's a peak at 12 months, a peak at 18 months, a peak at 24 months, and again at 30. So we think that there's some informal type of negotiation going on. A soldier is saying, I've been in France for a year. There's no prospect of the war ending. This is 1917. The war could go on for 2-3 more years. I'm not doing regular tours of duty like in Afghanistan, where I know I go for 6 months, I have a break for a year, and then I go again. You go to France, you stay there until the war is over, or you're killed or wounded, or you come home on a specialist trip, may get some promotion or do some training. So at some point, soldiers are saying, I've been here 24 months, I've done my bit, I can't do any more, and I'm using shell-shock to negotiate my release from the front line. And what's interesting is the doctors are agreeing to it because it's the regimental medical officers that's making the original referral. And he's saying, yeah, I know you're a trustworthy soldier, you've done your bit, it's not fair to keep you here. And so there's some unofficial negotiation going on where everyone sort of understands. So one of the conclusions from this is the British Army, by 1917, had accepted that people couldn't cope forever, but you had to earn your breakdown. So if you pitch up in week 1 in France and say, oh, I'd really like to go home, you wouldn't get the treatment that you'll get when you've been there for 2 years. We were lucky that our shell-shock unit was running during the Battle of Messines Ridge. And you can see why the casualties occur. Charging up a hill into machine guns, probably not a very good idea. And they suffer huge numbers of casualties within a week. And they come to the unit that we studied, and you can see straight away how the numbers go through the roof in terms of admissions. And these are not the total numbers, because the shell-shock unit can't cope with the level of casualties, so they're going everywhere. But it's got enough beds to take these and no more. And you can see how it's the frontline troops that are breaking down. 91% of admissions are frontline troops. So it really is the people who are exposed to the most danger, the most trauma, who are ending up in the shell-shock unit. And we can see also, if you look in the Lancet and the BMJ, all the doctors were saying, well, 80% return to duty, 90%, but everyone gets better. The reality is that 17% go straight back to duty. Once you've been through this, the odds are you won't go back to the front line. You'll go to base duties. You'll go back to the UK. You'll go to another hospital. And this is a lesson that the British Army has to learn quite slowly. So what happens in the UK by comparison? At the beginning of the war, they're puzzled. They're not ready for shell shock. And so they open a specialist treatment unit in Moss Side near Maghall, and they set up a research unit down at King's College Hospital with Frederick Mort. So Maghall was originally a hospital built for epilepsy, but it's taken over in December 1917. It hasn't got large numbers of beds, about 500 beds by the end of the war, And initially, they think, oh, this place will fill up with psychotic patients. And initially, there are lots of patients there with severe mental illness. But once Shellshot's on the agenda, they remove those, and this becomes their experimental treatment unit. Class system, so the officers go to this really nice house down the road while the soldiers are in the big wards in the villas. And they gather together, because this is high profile and people are volunteering, they gather together some of the top specialists from different areas during the war. And Henry Head said, you know, this is a centre of excellence, a band of sort of brilliant researchers. And here we see Brown again, now in uniform, Rivers, and Graft and Elliott Smith. So they're recruiting people from these departments of experimental psychology and elsewhere. Pear, who is a lecturer in experimental psychology at Manchester before the war, says, we started to think in different ways about mental illness. Elliott Smith had the idea that you could trace the spread of culture. He was a professor of anatomy in Cairo before the war, and one of his hobbies was tracing the spread of Egyptian culture. He had a diffusionist idea that if you followed trade routes and migration, you could see how culture spread. And so that's one of their ideas for Shellshot, that it's transmitted through conversations, through groups. Very different way of thinking about mental illness from, say, germ or hereditary, that this is a cultural, social phenomenon. They start to do real psychology here, so they're seeing patients on a one-to-one basis, and they're finding out, you know, what's wrong, what's troubling them, and saying, in mild cases, a lot of time, that's really all you have to do, and people will then start to get better. Again, we can see, if we go up to Craig Lockhart, where Rivers transfers from Maghall, doctors don't have protocols or targets, they're free to pursue their own ideas. And Wilfred Owen, of course, is treated there by Arthur Brock. And Brock's idea is that people break down on the battlefield because they've been removed from their peacetime environment. So the cure should be the opposite. On the wall there is Hercules lifting up Antaeus, and Hercules defeats Antaeus, the monster, because he derives his strength from Mother Earth. And he's robbed of his power and efficiency when you lift him up. And he says this is what happened to Wilfred Owen and others. They've been lifted out of their normal environment, and they've become weak, and that's caused their shell shock. They're not operating in a system that gives them confidence and reassurance. So his treatment is the opposite, to ground people, to say to Owen, go out, write poetry, teach, meet people, study the fauna, you know, engage in all the things you would do in peacetime, and that will get you better. Rivers' different view, Rivers schooled in Freudian psychology, so his classic case is of the frontline infantry officer who has panic attacks when he's in a dugout. He says, it's not really about the war. If we talk to this officer, we'll find that when he was a small child, he was imprisoned by his nanny in a cupboard. So this is repressed childhood, the re-emergence of repressed childhood trauma, and if we explore his childhood experience, that will enable him to address his behaviour today. And Rivers says, you know, having worked through this awful childhood trauma, the man is now able to travel on the underground and return to the front line. So lots of different hypotheses being explored. The other thing that changes is that shell shock is treated in the centre of town in prestigious buildings. In sharp contrast to the 19th century, where asylums are out in the countryside in big, 1,000-bed buildings, so people, and that of course leads to stigma, because there's a sense of marginalisation. Shell shock patients are originally funded through charities, are being treated in these major buildings in the centre of London by doctors from medical schools who are giving their time for free because of the war effort. So straight away, you've got a change in the context, the place, and the people who are doing the treatment. These are initially charitable ones. Here, for example, is Palace Green. It's now an embassy. It's one of the most expensive roads in London, but it's taken over, funded by charity, as a shell shock hospital. And here's one of the patients treated from the Coldstream Guards, Kluger. He goes there, and initially they adopt the methods used for neurasthenia. So it's complete rest, no distraction, in bed, no talking. And after a few weeks, he's getting really fed up that he's not allowed to talk to anyone, because the idea is that you've got to have complete rest for the central nervous system. And the way he gets around it, he says, well, actually, I'm extremely religious, and I need to talk to a priest. He's not religious at all, but he just desperately wants to talk to someone. And so having broken that, the priest comes to see him, and then he's able to start building up relationships. And he builds up a relationship with Eileen, his VAD, falls in love with her, gets better, realizes he's missing her so much that he makes himself ill by drinking whiskey and gets readmitted for another 3 months. And then, but therapy for him was obviously working there. The government realizes that these independent charitable institutions are working, so the Ministry of Pensions funds very similar hospitals in large houses in central London with lots of occupational therapy to get people better. And here's Siegfried Sassoon in this building in 1918, recovering from wounds, saying, well, this is one of the best hospitals I could possibly be. He's visited there by Rivers. So a very different program to what you would have seen in the pre-war period. Similar thing happens at the Maudsley. The Maudsley opens in 1916, and it rapidly expands, takes over a local school. William Brown, who we've seen earlier, was the first resident medical officer, remaining there till autumn 1916, when he goes off to a forward psychiatric unit in France, and then having finished there, in April 1918, goes to Craig Lockhart. So William Brown is sort of moving through all these institutions as a sort of personal link. Maudsley has huge numbers of patients because it's an assessment centre as well as doing treatment. So over 12,000 patients by the end of the war. And what do? They try to create this atmosphere of cure. They want to create a place where people want to get better. Quite the opposite of, say, an asylum. So they're providing better quality food, Mott campaigns to have the calorific value of meals at the Maudsley increased. They've got tennis courts, they go on outdoor activity, anything to make people feel better and feel confident. Officers, again, of course, get better treatment. They're up the road in this big house that's donated to them. Mott is not particularly interested in hypnosis or psychoanalysis. He feels it could be a distraction and it might re-traumatize servicemen going through what might be a cathartic experience. So he's very much concerned with activity, positive thinking, and doing things and restoring confidence. So one of the things they do is they plant flower beds, they have a vegetable patch, they keep hens. He persuades Lady Bentinck to put in a big hut, which they do woodwork and metalwork. So it's anything to get people's spirits up. And he's ahead of Gareth Malone. He encourages singing. He donates a piano. He's a choral singer himself. And he says, because this will give you a sense of well-being and corporate spirit. The best tonic, however, he says, comes in 1917, is the assurance that you can say, because the regulations have changed, the British Army's finally realising that if a man has been in France for 2 years or a year and he's traumatised, it's daft to send him back. And they changed the regulations in 1917 and say, you can say to your patients, I promise you will not go back for at least 6 months. And so that's one reason why you get significant numbers of cures reported in 1917. The problem is they break their word. Having said you don't have to go back, they have all the battles of Passchendaele and the German Spring Offensive, and of course the word is broken, and this spreads. So they have to change the regulations yet again in the spring of 1918. And they do it quite surreptitiously. Generals go round to the Shellshot hospitals and say, this is not official, but you can say to your patients, if you get better, you can be discharged from the army. Or you can put it the other way and say, so as long as you're ill, as long as you've got symptoms, I'm not able to let you go, and there's well-paid jobs in munitions factories. So there's a sort of sense of reality that comes in 1918 that the shell-shock servicemen are blocking beds, they're not getting better, we need the space for the wounded, so let's do our best and say, we've tried to treat you, it hasn't worked, you're much better off working in a factory. And so there is a process, again, of negotiation right at the very end of the war. So when the war ends, the shell-shock doctors spread to medical schools and universities throughout the UK. And having discovered all this, they want to use their knowledge in civilian peacetime economy. And here's a group, my favourite photograph, it's a Shellshot conference in December 1918 outside the main door of the Maudsley. And in a sense, it's a sort of gathering of the leading researchers, so that you've got Rivers here, Frederick Mott over here, T.A. Ross, who runs the castle, Jimmy James, who goes to St Mary's, Bernard Hart, who goes to University College. So in a sense, they then spread out, and this guy, amazing name of Farquhar Buzzard, goes off and becomes professor of medicine at Oxford. So, he's got himself into a position of real authority and influence. And they write, of course, because having done all this clinical work, they think we mustn't lose the benefit. This is hard-won, tough experience, and we need to make sure that it's taken up in the 1920s and 30s. And there is, immediately after the war, there's this strange sense of optimism. So here we are, the professor of physics at Cambridge saying, we're on the verge of solving major mental illness. They think because they can treat shell shock, and they've discovered the effect of the environment, the effect of traumatic experience, we're very, very close, they think, to solving major mental illness, schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, and they think they're going to be emptying the mental hospitals in the next 10 years because they believe if they get these illnesses very early, they will stop their development. And the problem, they think, is the asylums are taking people who are certified, whose diseases are well established. And we've simply just got to do what we were doing with shell shock, is get people early in the very earliest stages of the illness. And Myers here says, we've learnt about emotion. In the pre-war period, we were doing testing, but what the really exciting thing is now, let's apply this knowledge to patients and see what effect that has. Again, here, Kinnear Wilson at Queen Square saying, all this clinical knowledge that we've found has given us a new dimension to take on major mental illness. And so there is this sort of early impetus. McDougall, disillusioned going back to Oxford because of the philosophical approach, goes off to Harvard, where he can do a more purposeful psychology, a goal-directed behavior, again, using his experience of working as a shell-shock doctor down at Netley and in Oxford. William Brown goes back to King's, but then goes to Oxford when McDougall goes overseas, and Francis Aveling comes in Brown's place. And Aveling has been a chaplain in the First World War, so he's got direct experience of traumatized soldiers. And as you can see, then that influences publications on fear responses and publishes very much in the fear of motivation and will and the influence on affect and cognition. Nevertheless, having said that, his department remains relatively small and he struggles to establish it, and he has just very small rooms up at the top. And I have a feeling that when he dies in 1941, King's loses its psychology department, which I'm told this morning moves to Birkbeck. So something goes wrong at King's in the late 1930s. It doesn't quite take off. You do get small hospitals set up as well. The Castle, of course, with Dr. Ross, who I've mentioned. Again, it's deliberately designed to take the knowledge from the war and apply it to civilian life, to industrial settings. Tavistock, again, Crichton Miller's a shell-shock doctor. But it remains they're small-scale hospitals, and Miller has real problems getting any money from the MRC. They're not interested, and even the Rockefeller Foundation, which gives cash to the Maudsley, won't give it to the Tavistock Clinic. So they have a real problem in getting past this initial sort of encroaching into clinical work. It's very difficult to move beyond the sort of beachhead. There are departments of psychological medicine opened at Guy's, University College, and at King's. So there's a sort of, and the idea there is to integrate all this knowledge into mainstream medical teaching, because pre-war, psychiatry is not taught to medical students. It's something they're expected to acquire once they've qualified. But there's resistance. So Farquhar Buzzard, who we saw sitting in the photograph, he says, I still don't think psychiatry should be taught to medical students. You don't want to waste their time with that. If they want to do it later on. So again, they don't quite establish psychological medicine across the board in major teaching hospitals. And by the mid-1920s, the disillusionment is beginning to sort of spread, and the breakthroughs in treatment that they thought would happen haven't come. And as you can see, the number of asylum beds goes up and up. So in terms of practical treatment of most patients, there's no sustained change in the 1920s and 30s. And the number of psyche beds continues to rise until 1959. Edward Maypother always was sceptical. His mother had schizophrenia, his sister had schizophrenia. He marries but doesn't have children because he's concerned about passing on the illness to any children he might have. And by 1931, he says, we have to be realistic. We haven't discovered new effective interventions at this stage. And Culpin here, Mille Culpin, who, again, a shell-shock doctor, says, you know, we use psychoanalysis, we think about it, but you've got to be really careful about talking about it. If you're known as psychoanalytically orientated, mainstream medicine will think you're loopy and won't take you seriously. So you've got to be careful about when you talk about it. And Myers too, becomes disillusioned at Cambridge, and he leaves and he sets up the Institute for Industrial Psychology. And you can see that he doesn't. The membership of the society is 700 in 1921, and it's only increased to 750 by 1936. So a lot of important things are done, a lot of groundwork is done, but there isn't a big follow-through in terms of training and application in the clinical setting. So my general conclusion is that the First World War opens the door, but the big force of change and innovation comes during and after the Second World War. It's almost as if they needed another war to traumatize a fresh swathe of population, to draw in another group of psychiatrists and psychologists before you get the sort of services that we're accustomed to seeing today. So the price they paid a horrific price in the First World War in terms of casualties, and there's a lot of important knowledge. But the sadness is that it isn't carried through into mainstream clinical practice.